Hello and welcome back. Some breaking news to bring you now. Sky News can now confirm that sources have told us that Ukraine has fired UK-supplied Storm Shadow missiles into Russia. The missiles first given to Ukraine in May of 2023, and there had been long-running debate and calls from the Ukrainians to be allowed to fire those missiles on targets in Russia. Well, after President Joe Biden gave the Ukrainians the license to use US-supplied ATACMS missiles to fire onto Russian targets inside Russia, it now appears, according to the sources that have spoken here to us at Sky News, that this UK-supplied Storm Shadow cruise missile has now been fired by the Ukrainians into Russia for the first time. All right. Please say we've got our defence analyst, Sean Bell, here with us. Sean, so that news now being confirmed by a source to Sky News that this Storm Shadow cruise missile has been used. Your reaction to that first?
Well, firstly, I'd be surprised if it's the first time that it's been used like that. You'll recall that last year when the commitment was made by the British government, the then British government, I'm pretty confident that Lord Cameron at the time said that as long as these weapons are used within the limits of the law of armed conflict, that President Zelensky can use them as he sees fit. I think it was later when, particularly after August and when the Ukrainians had actually gone into Russia itself, there was a lot more nervousness. The Americans said, look, we ought to have a NATO-wide view about this. It shouldn't be individual countries. And I think that's the point at which the clearance was rescinded. But they've had these weapons for some time. We've seen them being used across in occupied Ukraine for some time. I'd be quite surprised if they haven't been used for select targets further on, because they're a unique capability that are very, very effective at striking Russian logistics hubs, headquarters, ammunition dumps, exactly the sorts of things which Ukraine would have wanted to strike. But of course, it's the first time under this new regime, and we've noted that the Prime Minister has refused to make a statement on it, which actually I admire, because taking the flame, the heat out of this, because every announcement that gets made, President Putin jumps all over. Yeah. Really, as long as the British government's made it clear, then that's it.
OK, Sean, for now, thank you for that. I appreciate the analysis. Stay with us, because I want to bring in our Security and Defence Editor, Deborah Haynes, for her analysis on all of this. Deb, great to have you with us. So, look, that's confirmed to Sky News by a source that Ukraine has now fired these Storm Shadow cruise missiles into Russia.
Yeah, so a source told me that this has happened, but it's important to stress it's not been officially confirmed yet, neither by the UK nor by Ukraine. Whether or not they choose to do that officially, that remains to be seen. There has in the past been a tactic of strategic ambiguity, like whose interest does it serve to publicly declare, yes, we have done it, especially given the tension and the particular stress around this decision of UK and US supplied cruise and ballistic missiles used against targets inside Russia. The Kremlin, Vladimir Putin himself, has for months now warned the West against taking this step, saying that it would throw fuel onto the flames of the conflict, maybe even trigger a global war. The US and British officials have long cautioned against listening to these warnings from Moscow, but there has been hesitancy in taking this decision. You'll remember a few days ago we reported about how Joe Biden had decided finally to allow the Ukrainians to use these ATACMS, these Army Tactical Missile System ballistic missiles, ground-launched systems against targets inside Russia. That was a huge shift in policy, in part because of Russia's decision to escalate the war with the introduction of North Korean troops on the ground fighting alongside Russian soldiers against Ukrainian forces. And at that time, on Sunday, when we were reporting on that, we were speculating that it would be likely for the UK to have done the same. And while Keir Starmer, while he's been here actually in Rio de Janeiro for the last couple of days, was asked repeatedly whether or not the UK had sanctioned the use of its Storm Shadow cruise missiles. These are weapons that are launched from jets against targets on the ground. He was very careful to avoid giving any kind of indication either way on that. And so it really was a case of it being a matter of time until there's evidence on the ground of those missiles being used, or until sources started to talk about it. And over the course of the last hour or so, a number of media outlets had started to report that this is the case, and a source has just told me that this is the case. But as I said, it remains to be seen whether we get official confirmation on this from the UK or from Ukraine.
OK, Deborah, for now, I hope you can stay with us, maybe check with your sources, because I want to bring in a guest now for a moment for his analysis of all of this. Arur Snell is a former Foreign Office diplomat and defence analyst. Arthur, thanks very much for being with us. Your reaction to this news as we are reporting that Storm Shadow has been fired into Russia for the first time by Ukraine?
Well, I don't think it's a surprise, given, obviously, the policy choice that President Biden made. And we shouldn't forget that Keir Starmer was pushing President Biden on this earlier in the summer, as I think, as Deborah mentioned there. My own view is that this is long overdue, that the Russians used this sort of idea of red lines to try and put fear into Ukraine's allies, and they've been rather successful. We've restricted ourselves from giving the Ukrainians the support they need as a result.
And now this reported usage, what does that do in terms of the potential reaction response from Russia, bearing in mind, of course, Arthur, the news we had yesterday of the lowering of the threshold by Putin for the use of nuclear weapons?
Yeah, so President Putin's been threatening nuclear war for about 24 years, which is about as long as he's been president. So I'm not saying we can be relaxed about this stuff, but it is how the Russians like to play. They will threaten nuclear annihilation to almost anyone and anything. As has been reported, what the major escalation which has occurred is the entry of another country's army into this war, and that is North Korea. So the sort of threats of escalation that we hear from Putin are largely empty.
Arthur, what does it do for the overall sort of war effort and the violence that's ongoing in Ukraine? You know, as you mentioned, the North Koreans, what are we expecting, 10,000 are there, maybe more to come. Reports yesterday that there were Iranian ballistic missiles in Russia waiting to be deployed. We're now allowing Storm Shadow to be fired in there. The Americans, the ATACMS, you know. The war going into its third year is as hot as it was.
Absolutely, yes. And this war won't be calming down unless one side or another is forced into a position where they can't continue fighting. Now, of course, that could happen if, for example, President Trump refused to continue supporting the Ukrainians with weapons. We don't know if that'll happen, but obviously there have been some indications that that's a risk. This new policy, both the US policy and this reported British policy, isn't going to transform Ukraine's situation in the war, just as the arrival of 10,000 North Korean troops won't transform Russia's situation relative to the actual number of Russian troops in the field. It's a relatively small number. This is going to be a very long and costly war. Particularly so if Western powers continue to give Ukraine a drip feed of support, which is what they have been doing for the past couple of years.
Well, Arthur, just a thought then on those Western powers. The Americans and the ATACMS are Storm Shadow. You'll also know that the French have supplied the Scout missile as well. Yeah. There's talk of the Germans providing the Taurus missile, which I think is a similar cruise missile. Are we expecting the confirmation of those armaments being used in this way in the next few days?
Well, I certainly think with the Scalp, which is basically identical to Storm Shadow, I would be very surprised if we don't hear that. Taurus is a bit different because Chancellor Scholz was very vocal against it. Now, you know, maybe he's changed his view and sort of moved on, but let's not forget that he made a phone call to Putin in recent days. So I'm not sure he's quite in the same place as the other major Western leaders on this.
Arthur, back to the Storm Shadow then. It was given in May 23. Do we know how many were given? Is it a continual, providing of this armament to Ukraine, or have we given what we're going to give and that's it?
Well, one of the issues with this is our own ability to produce these missiles is very much at a peacetime intensity. So I know that the UK and France have been very generous with the stocks that they have of this specific weapon system, but we're arguably not making them quick enough. And one of the issues that Ukraine faces is it is it is confronting Russia that has sort of re-engineered its economy for a war economy. It's producing, for example, 3 million artillery shells per year, whereas the entirety of the sort of European alliance in support of Russia is producing less than 1 million. So we're struggling to keep pace with Russia's wartime armaments production, and that's not even bringing into account, obviously, the supplies they're also getting from North Korea and Iran, among others.
And after that sort of brings me on to the reason you're actually booked to talk to us, to talk about the cuts to defence and the changes in that were announced by John Healey not so long ago. Are those decisions made so that the UK can continue to maintain some of its support for Ukraine in the regards to the Storm Shadow and other assets? Yeah, I mean, it's important that people understand that the top-level defence budget is not being cut. What they're doing is this is, an allocation within the existing departmental programmes and assets and so on. I'm not saying, that this isn't problematic. What it shows is that our defence forces are operating on an extremely tight budget, that they're stretched, that a lot of the equipment needs urgently renewing, and bluntly, the defence budget isn't big enough. But yes, you're right. The basically part of the reason for making these cuts is to free up resources that can then be used to continue to support Ukraine. You say the defence budget isn't big enough. We heard John Healey talk about getting to this 2.5% spending of GDP spending on defence at some point. The Conservative Party had promised that they were going to get there as well pretty soon. Are you in the camp of those? I mean, I was speaking to Julian Brazier earlier that thinks that actually more than 2.5% needs to be spent on defence. Yeah, there's no doubt about that. But I think we also we need to be sort of equally critical of both parties' approaches. The Conservatives made a promise to get to 2.5, but I don't think actually, if you looked at the numbers in their own budget, that there was any probability they were going to get there. Labour have sort of made a promise which doesn't quite have a date on it, and perhaps it's easier to criticise. But clearly, Labour are inheriting a vastly under-supported defence sector, which has been under-supported for under 14 years of Tory government. And Arthur, final thought from you then on these cuts and the removing of the capabilities of those bits of kit, that John Healey announced. There is some disagreement as to whether we could keep some of that stuff mothballed and then bring it out as soon as we need it, or it's best to get rid of it entirely. What's your sense of what should be done with that old kit? Well, I think it obviously, you've got a very wide range of items. There are some big old naval ships that probably it doesn't make sense to mothball because actually it becomes incredibly expensive and they deteriorate anyway. Similarly, they're talking about the Puma helicopters are about as old as I am, and I'm nearly 50. And they really just, they're right at the end of their conceivable service life. So some of those things, they really do have to go. I think the challenge, as always, is what's the gap? Because with all of these things, there are programs underway to either replace or to move to a new type of capability. But quite often we end up with a gap. So do we have, for example, amphibious landing craft? Do our Royal Marines have the ability to do what Royal Marines are supposed to be able to do? So I think there are lots of holes in Britain's overall defence picture and our ability to be a fairly serious defence player. But then what goes with that is the upcoming defence review, and some very hard decisions have to be made about what kind of a defence force overall, with all the different services, we're trying to put into the field. Absolutely. All right. Arur Snell, former Foreign Office diplomat. Really do appreciate your expertise today. Arthur, thanks for being with us. All right, well, as you can see, our military analyst Sean Bell is still here with us. Sean, pleased for that. Thank you very much. So, look, let's talk about this Storm Shadow cruise missile then. How will it be used by the Ukrainians? What kind of jet is it going to be mounted to that's deploying it? Well, how it's being used, I mean, first of all, how many are there left? In big handfuls. This is an old missile. You can't just nip down to the shops and buy a few more. And we are very worried about giving state-of-the-art technology to Ukraine, allowing it to fall potentially into other people's hands.
We had 1,000 missiles, about 200 were used. We were going to upgrade 300, that left 500. 500, I understand, most of those were gifted to Ukraine. I have no way of knowing how many have been used, but over the last year and a bit, we've seen regular occurrences where it looks like they've been very effective at striking a whole range of targets. So I'd be very surprised if there's many left. The challenge, therefore, is you can't easily rebuild a 30-year-old missile. And I think the danger is here that whilst a principle of being able to use them to strike targets like logistics hubs, headquarters and the like, deeper within Russia, which is invaluable, I think part of the messaging, though, is, you remember President Zelensky talked about building 1 million drones a year indigenously. That also included a ballistic missile, but also included long-range strike drones. And we've been helping, I believe, in the West, providing some of the ingredients, some of the technology, some of the components, some of the know-how, to build his own missiles, which don't have to go through all the safety cases and all of that, which takes a lot of money and a lot of time. He doesn't have to do that. He's at war. And I suspect, therefore, there's a lot going on behind the scenes of developing a national capability for Ukraine, even if it's just assembling bits and generating something and getting them out of the door. So it's important that this approval has been given. But actually, this is part of how does Ukraine develop the long-range capabilities it needs in order to prevail in this conflict.
Give us a thought, Sean, as to why this particular cruise missile is so effective. Is it because this is the best cruise missile that they have, or is it specific about the Storm Shadow that makes it so useful?
Part of the reason is that Ukraine inherited lots of old equipment from the former Soviet Union, and it didn't have any of these long-range missiles. It had unguided weapons, but nothing that could fly contour tracking, evade radars and then hit with precision strike. We've seen over the last couple of years headquarters of the Russian naval headquarters at Sevastopol was struck very, very effectively. These missiles are incredibly effective at precision strike at distance. The challenge, of course, if you're going to do that 200 miles away, you need to have satellite technology, a lot of intelligence. It's a complex operation. It's not just a question of firing a gun, off it goes. So they're really complex, but what it has done is it's pushed the Russian fighters further away from the coast with Ukraine. They need to be outside range. That means it's longer for them to fly and drop bombs on the Ukrainians. Therefore, the Russian Air Force is already going to be less effective because they've been used.